She asks for divorce after 50 years and discovers a secret that makes her fall in love again. Grandchildren are left stunned. After 50 years of marriage, Elizabeth asks for a divorce, believing her love story has reached its end. But fate has other plans. A long-buried secret emerges, bringing with it a young woman who shares her name and a past that will change everything. As shocking truths come to light, Elizabeth finds herself on an unexpected journey of rediscovery, proving that sometimes the greatest love stories have second acts. Get ready for a tale of family, forgiveness, and rekindled passion that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about lasting love. Elizabeth Thornton stood at the kitchen window, her gaze fixed on the meticulously manicured garden she had tended for half a century. The morning sun cast long shadows across the lawn, much like the doubts that had been creeping into her mind for months. At 72, with her silver hair neatly pinned back in hands that bore the gentle wrinkles of time, she clutched a porcelain mug of chamomile tea, its warmth a stark contrast to the chill settling in her heart. 50 years, she whispered to herself, the words hanging in the air like a fragile cobweb. 50 years of marriage to Richard, the man she had once believed was her soulmate. 50 years of shared dreams, raised children, and now, a house full of memories that seemed to mock her with every creak of the floorboards. The sound of shuffling feet broke her reverie. Richard, still in his navy blue robe, entered the kitchen with the day's newspaper tucked under his arm. "Morning, Lizzie," he mumbled, reaching for the coffee pot with the practiced ease of a daily ritual. Elizabeth felt her jaw clench at the nickname. When had it started to grate on her nerves? When had his presence become something she endured rather than cherished? "Richard," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "We need to talk." He looked up, his bushy eyebrows furrowing in confusion. "Can't it wait until after breakfast? The Johnsons are coming over to discuss the neighborhood watch program. Remember?" Elizabeth set her mug down with a soft clink. "No, it can't wait. I've been waiting for 50 years, and I can't wait another minute." Richard's hand froze midway to the sugar bowl. "Lizzie, what are you talking about?" She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the words she never thought she'd utter. "I want a divorce." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's face cycled through a range of emotions: confusion, disbelief, and finally, a resigned sadness that made Elizabeth's heart ache despite her resolve. "Is this about the cruise? I told you we'd go next year. Or is it because I forgot our anniversary last month?" "Lizzie," I said I was sorry. "I've been under a lot of stress with the new medication and—" Elizabeth raised a hand, cutting him off. "It's not about any one thing, Richard. It's about everything. And nothing. I don't feel like we're living anymore. We're just existing, side by side, like two strangers sharing a house." Richard sank into a chair, the newspaper forgotten on the counter. "Strangers? Lizzie, we've been married for 50 years. We raised 3 children together. We have grandchildren. How can you say we're strangers?" Elizabeth felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. "That's just it, Richard. We've been so focused on being parents and grandparents that we forgot how to be husband and wife. When was the last time we had a real conversation? When was the last time you looked at me and really saw me?" Outside, a lawnmower roared to life, the sound jarring in the tense quiet of the kitchen. Elizabeth watched as a range of emotions played across Richard's face: hurt, anger, and finally, a deep, sorrowful understanding. I didn't know you felt this way," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the distant hum of suburban life beyond their windows. Elizabeth felt a pang of guilt. "I should have said something sooner, but I kept hoping things would change on their own. They didn't." Richard stood up slowly, his movements betraying his age in a way Elizabeth had never noticed before. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Elizabeth squared her shoulders, determined to see this through. "I've already spoken to a lawyer. I think it's best if I stay with Claire for a while, just until we figure things out." As the words left her mouth, The reality of what she was doing hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. 50 years of shared history, about to be undone. But beneath the sadness and fear, there was also a glimmer of something else: hope. Hope for a new chapter, a chance to rediscover herself. Richard nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "If that's what you want, Lizzie. But please, before you go, can we at least talk about this? Really talk." Elizabeth hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Okay, Richard, we can talk. But first, I need some air. I'm going for a walk." As she turned to leave the kitchen, Elizabeth caught sight of their reflection in the window, two people who had shared a lifetime together, now standing on the precipice of a new and uncertain future. With a heavy heart, she stepped out into the morning sun, leaving behind the only life she had known for half a century. Little did Elizabeth know that her decision would set in motion a chain of events that would unearth long-buried secrets and redefine everything she thought she knew about love, family, and the man she had pledged to spend her life with. As Elizabeth walked through the familiar streets of their Connecticut suburb, the weight of her decision pressed heavily on her shoulders. The manicured lawns and picturesque houses that had once represented the American dream now felt like a facade, hiding the complexities of the lives within. She found herself at Maple Grove Park, where she and Richard had often taken their children and later their grandchildren. Settling onto a bench, Elizabeth watched as a young couple pushed a stroller along the path, their laughter carried on the breeze. "Mrs. Thornton?" a voice called out, startling her from her reverie. Elizabeth looked up to see Sarah Miller, her next-door neighbor of 30 years, approaching with a concerned expression. "Good morning, Sarah," Elizabeth replied, forcing a smile. Sarah sat down beside her, grocery bags rustling. "Is everything all right? I couldn't help but notice you seemed upset when you left the house earlier." For a moment, Elizabeth considered brushing off the question with a polite lie. But the events of the morning had left her craving honesty. "I've asked Richard for a divorce," she said quietly. Sarah's eyes widened in shock. "Oh, Elizabeth, I had no idea things were so difficult. You've always seemed like the perfect couple." Elizabeth let out a bitter chuckle. "Perfect on the outside, perhaps. But inside, we've been drifting apart for years. I just couldn't pretend anymore." As they talked, Elizabeth found herself opening up about the loneliness she'd felt, the growing distance between her and Richard, and her fear of spending her remaining years in a loveless marriage. Sarah listened attentively, offering words of support and understanding. "Have you told the children yet?" Sarah asked gently. Elizabeth shook her head. "No, not yet. I'm dreading that conversation, especially with the grandchildren. They idolize their grandfather." Just then, Elizabeth's phone buzzed with a text from her daughter, Claire. "Mom, is everything okay? Dad called and said you two had a fight. He sounded really upset." Elizabeth's heart sank. She hadn't wanted Richard to break the news like this. "I should go," she said to Sarah, standing up. "Thank you for listening." As Elizabeth walked home, she steeled herself for the difficult conversations ahead. She found Richard in his study, looking older and more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. "I called Claire," he said, his voice hoarse. I didn't know what else to do." Elizabeth sighed. "We should tell them together, Richard. They deserve to hear it from both of us." Richard nodded, then hesitated. "Lizzie, before we do that, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you years ago." Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. "What is it, Richard?" He took a deep breath. "It's about that summer 52 years ago when we were engaged. When I disappeared for 2 weeks without explanation." Elizabeth's mind raced back to that turbulent time, a period she'd forced herself to forget. "Richard, what are you saying?" "I think it's time you knew the truth," Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It might not change anything, but you deserve to know." As Richard began to speak, Elizabeth felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Little did she know that his revelation would set in motion a series of events that would challenge everything she thought she knew about their life together, and force her to confront feelings she thought long buried. Outside, the sun continued its arc across the sky, oblivious to the seismic shifts occurring within the Thornton household. The stage was set for a journey that would take Elizabeth, Richard, and their entire family through a labyrinth of long-held secrets, unexpected discoveries, and the possibility of rediscovering love in the most surprising of places. Richard's hands trembled as he reached for an old leather-bound journal tucked away in his desk drawer. Elizabeth watched, her heart pounding, as he opened it to a yellowed page marked with a faded red ribbon. "I've kept this hidden for over 5 decades, Richard began, his voice laden with regret. "That summer when I disappeared, I wasn't alone." Elizabeth felt her world tilt. "What do you mean, Richard? Who were you with?" Richard took a deep breath. "I was with Maria Delgado. Do you remember her? She worked at the library where we used to study." The name sent a jolt through Elizabeth's system. Maria Delgado, the vivacious young woman with dark curls and a melodious laugh. Elizabeth had always felt a twinge of jealousy when Richard would chat with her at the library desk. "Maria was pregnant," Richard continued, his words hanging heavy in the air. "She came to me, terrified and alone. Her family would have disowned her if they found out. I felt responsible." Elizabeth's mind reeled. "Responsible? Richard, are you saying?" He shook his head quickly. No, the child wasn't mine. But Maria had no one else to turn to. I helped her travel to her aunt in New Mexico, where she could have the baby in secret." As Richard spoke, Elizabeth's emotions whirled like a maelstrom. Anger at the deception, relief that there hadn't been an affair, confusion about why he had kept this secret for so long. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I made a promise to Maria. She was so scared, Lizzie. She made me swear I wouldn't tell anyone. Not even you. I thought I was doing the right thing." Elizabeth stood up abruptly, needing to put some physical distance between herself and the weight of this revelation. She walked to the window, staring out at the garden she had tended for so many years. How many other secrets had been buried beneath its soil? What happened to Maria? To the child? She asked, still facing away from Richard. "Maria stayed in New Mexico. She raised her daughter there. I've kept in touch over the years. Sent money when they needed it." Elizabeth whirled around, her eyes flashing. "You've been in contact with her all this time?" Richard nodded solemnly. "Once a year around Christmas, just to make sure they were okay. I never told you because I was afraid you wouldn't understand. I was afraid you'd think, well, what you probably think now." The silence that followed was deafening. Elizabeth's mind raced, trying to process this new information. All those years, the occasional unexplained phone calls, the times Richard seemed distracted around the holidays. It all suddenly made sense. "Lizzie," Richard said softly, breaking the silence, "I know this doesn't change the problems between us, but I couldn't let you leave without knowing the truth. You deserved that much." Elizabeth looked at her husband of 50 years, seeing him in a new light. The man she thought she knew everything about had carried this secret for their entire marriage. It was a burden that had clearly weighed on him, yet he had borne it out of a misguided sense of honor and protection. "I need some time to process this, Richard," Elizabeth said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm still going to stay with Claire for a while, but thank you for telling me." As she turned to leave the study, Richard called out, "There's one more thing, Lizzie. Maria's daughter, her name is Elizabeth. Maria named her after you." Elizabeth froze in the doorway, her hand on the knob. Without turning back, she nodded once and left the room, closing the door softly behind her. As she walked down the hallway to pack her bags, Elizabeth's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. The man she had been ready to leave just hours ago had suddenly become a mystery to her again. And somewhere out there was a woman named Elizabeth, unknowingly connected to her by a decades-old act of kindness. Little did Elizabeth know that this revelation was just the beginning. The decision she had made that morning would set in motion a series of events that would not only challenge her perception of her marriage, but also lead her on a journey of self-discovery, forgiveness, and the possibility of rekindling a love she thought was lost forever. The following day, Elizabeth found herself in Claire's guest room, surrounded by hastily packed suitcases and a lifetime of memories. The morning sun filtered through unfamiliar curtains, casting a surreal glow on her new, temporary reality. A gentle knock on the door roused Elizabeth from her thoughts. "Mom!" Claire's voice was soft, tinged with concern. "Can I come in?" "Of course, dear," Elizabeth replied, straightening her posture on the edge of the bed. Claire entered, carrying a steaming mug of tea. Her eyes, so much like Richard's, were filled with worry. "How are you holding up?" Elizabeth accepted the tea gratefully. "I'm managing," she said, the words feeling inadequate. "It's a lot to process." Claire sat beside her mother, placing a comforting hand on her arm. "Dad told us about Maria and Elizabeth," she said quietly. "It's quite a shock." Elizabeth nodded, sipping her tea to buy time before responding. 50 years of marriage, and I thought I knew everything about your father. Now, I feel like I'm seeing him for the first time. Are you angry with him?" Claire asked hesitantly. Elizabeth paused, considering the question. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "Part of me is furious that he kept this secret for so long. But another part admires the man who would go to such lengths to help someone in need." As they talked, Elizabeth found herself opening up to her daughter in a way she never had before. She shared her feelings of disconnect, the gradual erosion of intimacy, and the fear of spending her twilight years in a passionless marriage. Claire listened attentively, offering support and occasionally challenging her mother's perspective. "But Mom," she said gently, "don't you think this revelation shows a side of Dad you'd forgotten? The compassionate, selfless man you fell in love with?" Elizabeth felt a lump form in her throat. "Perhaps," she conceded, "but it also shows how easily he could keep things from me. How do I trust him now?" Their conversation was interrupted by the chiming of Claire's phone. She glanced at it and her eyes widened. "It's Josh," she said, referring to Elizabeth's grandson. "He's asking if he can come over. I think he wants to talk to you." Elizabeth nodded, steeling herself for another difficult conversation. Within the hour, Josh arrived, his usually cheerful face clouded with confusion and concern. "Grandma," he said, embracing Elizabeth tightly. "What's going on? Is it true you're divorcing Grandpa?" Elizabeth led Josh to the living room, where they sat on Claire's plush sofa. She took a deep breath and began to explain the situation, careful to omit the details about Maria and her namesake. Josh listened intently, his brow furrowed. When Elizabeth finished, he was quiet for a moment before speaking. "Grandma, I don't understand. You and Grandpa have always been like relationship goals for all of us. What changed?" Elizabeth smiled sadly at her grandson's use of modern slang. "Oh, Josh, sometimes things change so gradually you don't notice until it's too late. Your grandfather and we lost sight of each other somewhere along the way." Josh shook his head, a determined look in his eyes. "But it's not too late, is it? I mean, you guys have been through so much together. There's got to be a way to fix this." His words, filled with the optimism of youth, struck a chord in Elizabeth's heart. She found herself wondering if perhaps she had been too hasty in her decision. But then the memory of years of emotional distance resurfaced, and she sighed. "It's complicated, Josh. More complicated than you know." As if on cue, Elizabeth's phone buzzed with a text from Richard. "Lizzie, I know you need space, but there's more you need to know. About Maria and Elizabeth. Can we talk?" Elizabeth stared at the message, her heart racing. What more could there possibly be? And did she even want to know? As she sat there, caught between her grandson's hopeful gaze and the weight of Richard's unspoken revelations, Elizabeth realized that her journey was far from over. The decision she had made just days ago had set in motion a chain of events that would force her to confront not just her marriage, but her own identity and the true meaning of love and forgiveness. Little did she know that the biggest surprises were yet to come, and that the path ahead would lead her to rediscover not just her relationship with Richard, but herself as well. Elizabeth's fingers hovered over her phone, Richard's text message glowing on the screen. After a moment's hesitation, she replied, "Okay, meet me at Rosewood Cafe tomorrow at 2 p.m. The following afternoon, Elizabeth found herself seated in a quiet corner of the cafe, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of Earl Grey. The familiar aroma brought back memories of countless afternoons spent here with Richard, discussing their dreams and plans for the future. Now, those memories felt like relics from another life. The bell above the door chimed, and Richard entered. He looked older somehow, the weight of their situation etched in the lines of his face. As he approached, Elizabeth noticed he was carrying a small, worn leather satchel. "Lizzie," he said softly, taking the seat across from her. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." Elizabeth nodded, her expression guarded. "You said there was more I needed to know, Richard. What is it?" Richard took a deep breath, his hands shaking slightly as he opened the satchel. He pulled out a bundle of letters, held together by a faded blue ribbon. "These are from Maria," he explained. "She's been writing to me every year, updating me on Elizabeth's life." Elizabeth felt a pang of jealousy, quickly followed by curiosity. "And you've kept them all this time?" Richard nodded. "I have, but that's not all." He hesitated, then continued, "Elizabeth, Maria's daughter. She's been trying to find her birth father, and she's coming here to Connecticut. She arrives next week." Elizabeth's eyes widened in shock. "Here? But why? Does she know about us?" "No," Richard said quickly. "She doesn't know anything about our involvement. But Lizzie, there's something else you need to know." He paused, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I think I know who Elizabeth's father is." The cafe around them seemed to fade away as Elizabeth processed this new information. "Who?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Richard leaned in closer. "Do you remember Thomas Reeves? He used to work at the bank with my father." Elizabeth nodded slowly, a foggy memory surfacing. Vaguely, "Didn't he move away suddenly?" "He did," Richard confirmed. "Right around the time Maria left for New Mexico. I always had my suspicions, but I never said anything. I didn't think it was my place." Elizabeth sat back, her mind reeling. Thomas Reeves. She remembered him now. A charming man with a reputation as a ladies' man. She had always felt uncomfortable around him, though she could never pinpoint why. "So what happens now?" Elizabeth asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Richard ran a hand through his thinning hair. "I don't know, but I felt you needed to know before Elizabeth arrives. This affects all of us, Lizzie. And I was hoping, maybe we could face this together." Elizabeth looked at her husband of 50 years, seeing not just the man who had kept secrets, but also the one who had sacrificed his own peace of mind to help others. She felt a stirring of something she thought long dormant, a mix of admiration and affection. "I'm not ready to come home yet, Richard," she said softly. "But I think you're right. We should face this together." As they sat there, surrounded by the gentle hum of the cafe, Elizabeth realized that the journey she had embarked upon was far more complex than she had ever imagined. The arrival of the young Elizabeth threatened to upend not just their lives, but potentially those of others in their community. Yet, as she looked at Richard, she saw a glimmer of the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. Compassionate, principled, and willing to stand by those in need. For the first time since she had asked for a divorce, Elizabeth felt a flicker of hope. "Tell me more about her," Elizabeth found herself saying. "About young Elizabeth. What do the letters say?" As Richard began to share the story of the young woman named after her, Elizabeth felt herself being drawn into a narrative that was both foreign and strangely familiar. Little did she know that the arrival of this unknown Elizabeth would not only challenge everything she thought she knew about her life, but also offer an unexpected chance at redemption, understanding, and perhaps a rekindling of a love she thought was lost forever. The afternoon sun slanted through the cafe windows, casting a warm glow over the couple as they bent their heads together, poring over the letters that held the key to their shared future. Outside, life in their small Connecticut town continued as usual, unaware of the seismic shifts occurring within the walls of Rosewood Cafe. The week leading up to young Elizabeth's arrival passed in a blur of anticipation and anxiety. Elizabeth found herself oscillating between curiosity about the young woman who bore her name and trepidation about the changes her presence might bring. On the day of Elizabeth's arrival, Richard and Elizabeth agreed to meet her together at the local train station. As they stood on the platform, the spring breeze carrying the scent of blooming dogwoods, Elizabeth felt a strange sense of déjà vu. It reminded her of the day she and Richard had returned from their honeymoon, full of hope and dreams for the future. The train pulled into the station with a screech of brakes and a hiss of steam. Passengers began to disembark, and among them, a young woman stepped onto the platform, her eyes scanning the crowd. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. The resemblance was uncanny. Young Elizabeth had Maria's dark curls and olive skin, but her eyes, they were unmistakably like Thomas Reeves. Richard squeezed Elizabeth's hand gently, a gesture of support that surprised her with its familiarity and comfort. They approached the young woman together. "Elizabeth," Richard called out softly. The young woman turned, her face lighting up with recognition. "Mr. Thornton?" she replied, her voice carrying a hint of a southwestern accent. As they made their introductions, Elizabeth found herself studying the younger woman intently. There was something in her manner, a mix of nervousness and determination, that reminded Elizabeth of herself at that age. "It's so nice to finally meet you both," young Elizabeth said, her eyes darting between them. "My mom has told me so much about you, Mr. Thornton. And Mrs. Thornton, it's an honor to meet the woman I was named after." Elizabeth felt a lump form in her throat. "Please call me Lizzie," she managed to say. As they drove back to the house, Elizabeth had agreed to let young Elizabeth stay in their guest room. The conversation flowed more easily than any of them had expected. Young Elizabeth shared stories of her life in New Mexico, her work as a teacher, and her reasons for coming to Connecticut. "I've always wondered about my birth father," she explained, her voice tinged with a mix of hope and apprehension. "Mom never told me much, just that he was from here and that he probably didn't know about me. I thought it was time to find out the truth." Elizabeth and Richard exchanged a glance, the weight of their knowledge heavy between them. They had agreed not to mention Thomas Reeves unless young Elizabeth brought it up herself. As they pulled into the driveway of the house that Elizabeth had left just a week ago, she felt a strange sense of homecoming. The familiar sight of her garden, now bursting with spring blooms, tugged at her heart. Young Elizabeth gasped softly. "It's beautiful," she said, her eyes wide as she took in the Victorian house with its wraparound porch, "just like in the pictures Mom showed me." As they helped young Elizabeth settle into the guest room, Elizabeth found herself warming to the young woman's presence. There was something about her that felt both familiar and refreshingly new. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table, the conversation turned to family stories. Young Elizabeth was eager to hear about the Thorntons' life together, and Elizabeth found herself sharing anecdotes she hadn't thought about in years. "And then Richard, trying to impress my father, decided to help with the barbecue. Next thing we knew, the entire grill was on fire," Elizabeth recounted, laughing at the memory. Richard chuckled, shaking his head. "Your father never let me near the grill again after that." As laughter filled the room, Elizabeth caught Richard's eye across the table. For a moment, she saw a flicker of the man she had fallen in love with, kind, funny, and full of life. It stirred something within her, a feeling she had thought long dormant. Later that night, as Elizabeth lay in bed in Claire's guest room, her mind swirled with the events of the day. The arrival of young Elizabeth had brought with it a whirlwind of emotions and memories. But more than that, it had shown her a side of Richard she had almost forgotten existed. As she drifted off to sleep, Elizabeth found herself wondering if perhaps, just perhaps, there was more to salvage in their marriage than she had initially thought. Little did she know that young Elizabeth's presence would catalyze a series of events that would challenge everything she thought she knew about love, forgiveness, and the power of second chances. The journey that had begun with a request for divorce was far from over. In fact, It was about to take an unexpected turn that would lead Elizabeth to rediscover not just her relationship with Richard, but herself as well. The following days brought a whirlwind of activity to the Thornton household. Young Elizabeth's presence seemed to breathe new life into the old house, her curiosity and enthusiasm infectious. Elizabeth found herself rediscovering her own home through the young woman's eyes, noticing details she had long since stopped seeing. One afternoon, as Elizabeth was showing young Elizabeth old photo albums in the living room, Richard entered, his face pale and his hands clutching a manila envelope. "Lizzie, Elizabeth," he said, his voice strained. "There's something we need to discuss." Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. She recognized that tone. It was the same one he had used when he first told her about Maria. "What is it, Richard?" Richard sat down heavily in his armchair. "I've been doing some digging, trying to find information about Thomas Reeves," he began, glancing at young Elizabeth. "And I've found something unexpected." Young Elizabeth leaned forward, her eyes wide. "Thomas Reeves? Is he my father?" Richard nodded slowly. "We believe so. But Elizabeth, there's more to the story." He took a deep breath before continuing. "Thomas Reeves didn't just leave town all those years ago. He died." The room fell silent, the weight of Richard's words hanging heavily in the air. Young Elizabeth's face paled, her hands trembling slightly as she processed the information. "How?" she whispered. "When?" Richard opened the envelope, pulling out several newspaper clippings. "It was a car accident, about a month after he left town. The reports say he was driving to New Mexico." Elizabeth gasped softly, the pieces falling into place. "He was going to find Maria," she realized aloud. Young Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. He was coming for us?" Richard nodded solemnly. "It appears so. I'm so sorry, Elizabeth. I had no idea until now." As young Elizabeth broke down, Elizabeth moved to comfort her, wrapping an arm around the younger woman's shoulders. She looked at Richard over Elizabeth's head, seeing the pain and regret in his eyes. "There's more," Richard said quietly, once young Elizabeth's sobs had subsided. "Thomas left a will, and Elizabeth, you're named in it." The revelation sent shockwaves through the room. Young Elizabeth looked up, her tear-stained face a mix of confusion and hope. "What does that mean?" Richard explained that Thomas had left a small estate, including a property in town that had been in his family for generations. "He must have changed his will right before he left," Richard concluded. "It's been in probate all these years because they couldn't locate you or Maria." As the implications of this news sank in, Elizabeth found herself reevaluating everything she thought she knew about the situation. Thomas Reeves, the man she had always thought of as irresponsible and careless, had been on his way to take responsibility for his actions when tragedy struck. Looking at Richard, Elizabeth saw not just the man who had kept secrets, but also the man who had spent decades trying to make things right. She felt a surge of emotion, gratitude, admiration, and something else she couldn't quite name. Young Elizabeth, still processing the revelations, looked between Richard and Elizabeth. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice small. Elizabeth took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. "Now," she said softly, "we honor your father's wishes, and we help you claim your inheritance." As the three of them sat there, surrounded by the echoes of the past and the promise of the future, Elizabeth realized that this journey was far from over. The arrival of young Elizabeth and the uncovering of these long-buried truths had set in motion a chain of events that would challenge them all to re-examine their understanding of family, loyalty, and love. Little did Elizabeth know that the biggest test of her marriage and her heart was yet to come. As she looked at Richard, she felt a flickering of the old feelings she thought were long extinguished. Could this shared mission to help young Elizabeth be the key to rekindling their own relationship? The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the room, much like the secrets that had finally come to light. Outside, life in their small Connecticut town continued as usual, unaware of the seismic shifts occurring within the walls of the Thornton home. In the days that followed, the Thornton household buzzed with activity. Young Elizabeth, with Richard and Elizabeth's help, began the process of claiming her inheritance. The journey through legal paperwork and visits to the county clerk's office brought the three of them closer together, united in a common purpose. One evening, as they sat on the porch after a long day of sorting through documents, young Elizabeth turned to Richard and Elizabeth with tears in her eyes. "I can't thank you both enough for everything you're doing," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I feel like I've found the family I never knew I had." Elizabeth felt her heart swell with affection for the young woman. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, reaching out to squeeze young Elizabeth's hand. "You are family." Richard nodded in agreement, his eyes misty. "We're honored to be part of your life, Elizabeth." As young Elizabeth excused herself to make a phone call to her mother, Elizabeth found herself alone with Richard for the first time in days. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the sounds of crickets and distant laughter from neighboring houses. "You know, Lizzie," Richard said softly, breaking the silence, "watching you with young Elizabeth, it reminds me of why I fell in love with you all those years ago." Elizabeth turned to look at her husband, surprised by the candor in his voice. "Oh," Richard nodded, a wistful smile on his face. "Your compassion, your strength, the way you've opened your heart to her. It's beautiful to see." Elizabeth felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. "Richard," she began, her voice hesitant, "I've been thinking." But before she could continue, young Elizabeth burst back onto the porch, her face alight with excitement. "I just talked to Mom," she announced. "She's coming here." The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation. As they readied the house for Maria's arrival, Elizabeth found herself working side by side with Richard, their movements falling into a familiar rhythm. She caught herself smiling at his little jokes, appreciating the way he anticipated her needs before she could voice them. The day Maria arrived was charged with emotion. As the petite woman with salt and pepper curls stepped out of the taxi, Elizabeth felt a mix of anxiety and curiosity. This was the woman who had shaped so much of their lives without ever being present. "Maria," Richard said warmly, stepping forward to greet her. "Welcome." Maria's eyes darted between Richard and Elizabeth, a lifetime of unspoken words passing between them. "Thank you," she said softly, "both of you, for everything." As they all settled in the living room, the air thick with tension and unasked questions, young Elizabeth began to share the story of her father and her inheritance. Maria listened, tears streaming down her face. "I never knew," she whispered. "All these years, I thought he had just forgotten about us." Elizabeth, moved by Maria's pain, found herself reaching out to comfort the other woman. "He was coming for you," she said gently. "He wanted to make things right." As the evening wore on, filled with stories, tears, and even laughter, Elizabeth felt a shift in the atmosphere. The weight of secrets kept for decades seemed to lift, replaced by a sense of understanding and forgiveness. Later that night, as Elizabeth prepared for bed in the guest room at Claire's house, she heard a soft knock at the door. It was Richard. "Lizzie," he said, his voice low and earnest. "Seeing you today with Maria and young Elizabeth, I realized something." Elizabeth's heart quickened. "What's that?" Richard took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "I realized that I never stopped loving you. That all these years, even when we drifted apart, you were still the center of my world." Elizabeth felt tears prick her eyes. "Oh, Richard," she breathed. As they stood there, the moonlight streaming through the window, Elizabeth felt the walls she had built around her heart begin to crumble. The man before her was not perfect, but he was hers. And perhaps, just perhaps, the love they had shared for 50 years was worth fighting for. Little did they know that this moment of reconnection was just the beginning. The journey that had started with a request for divorce was about to take its most unexpected turn yet, leading them towards a rediscovery of not just their love for each other, but the very foundations of their lives together. The following weeks brought a flurry of activity and emotion to the Thornton household. With Maria's arrival, the dynamics shifted once again, creating a tapestry of relationships that were both old and new, complex and simple. One sunny afternoon, as Elizabeth tended to her garden with young Elizabeth by her side, she found herself opening up about her own journey. "You know," Elizabeth said, gently pruning a rosebush, "when you first arrived, I had just asked Richard for a divorce." Young Elizabeth looked up in surprise, her hands stilling on the watering can. "Really? But you seem so connected now." Elizabeth smiled softly. "Life has a funny way of bringing things full circle. Your arrival, learning about your father, seeing Richard in a new light. It's made me reevaluate everything." As they worked side by side, Elizabeth shared more about her feelings, the years of disconnect, and the recent rekindling of emotions. Young Elizabeth listened intently, offering insights that surprised Elizabeth with their wisdom and empathy. "It sounds like you and Richard have been given a second chance," young Elizabeth said thoughtfully. "That's pretty special, don't you think?" Elizabeth nodded, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "It is, and I'm beginning to think it's not one I want to let slip away." Later that evening, as the extended family gathered for dinner, Richard, Elizabeth, young Elizabeth, Maria, and even Claire and her family, Elizabeth found herself marveling at the scene before her. The dining room, once a place of stilted conversations and growing distance, now buzzed with laughter and animated discussions. Richard caught her eye across the table, giving her a warm smile that made her heart skip a beat. In that moment, Elizabeth made a decision. After dinner, as everyone moved to the living room for coffee, Elizabeth pulled Richard aside. "Can we talk?" she asked softly. Privately, they made their way to the porch, the night air cool and fragrant with blooming jasmine. Elizabeth took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Richard," she began, "these past few weeks have been transformative. I've seen sides of you I'd forgotten existed. I've remembered why I fell in love with you in the first place." Richard's eyes widened, hope flickering in their depths. "Lizzie, let me finish," Elizabeth said gently. "I know we have a lot of work to do. Years of distance don't disappear overnight. But I think I'd like to try again. With us." Richard's face broke into a smile that took years off his appearance. "Oh, Lizzie," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Nothing would make me happier." As they embraced, Elizabeth felt a sense of coming home. Not to the house they had shared for decades, but to each other, to the love that had been there all along, buried under years of misunderstandings and unspoken words. When they returned to the living room, hand in hand, the room fell silent. Young Elizabeth was the first to react, her face breaking into a radiant smile. "Does this mean?" she asked tentatively. Elizabeth nodded, feeling Richard's hand squeeze hers gently. "We're going to give it another try," she announced, her voice steady and sure. The room erupted in joy, Claire hugging her parents tightly, Maria wiping away happy tears, and young Elizabeth beaming with delight. As the celebrations continued around them, Elizabeth turned to Richard. "It won't be easy," she said softly. "We have a lot to work through." Richard nodded, his eyes serious but filled with love. "I know, but we've got 50 years of practice at being together, Lizzie. And now, we have a whole new family to help us along the way." Elizabeth looked around the room, at Claire, who had supported her through her darkest moments, at young Elizabeth, whose arrival had sparked this journey of rediscovery, at Maria, whose long-held secret had ultimately brought healing rather than harm. She felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. The journey that had begun with a request for divorce had led them here, to a new beginning, richer and more complex than anything Elizabeth could have imagined. As she leaned into Richard's embrace, surrounded by the warmth of family both old and new, Elizabeth realized that sometimes, the end of one chapter is just the beginning of an even more beautiful story. Little did they know that the biggest adventure of their lives was just beginning, one that would challenge them, strengthen them, and ultimately, redefine the very meaning of family and love. As autumn painted the Connecticut landscape in vibrant hues of red and gold, the Thornton family gathered once again, this time for a very special occasion. The old Victorian house buzzed with excitement and anticipation. Elizabeth stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting the delicate lace shawl draped over her shoulders. Her silver hair was elegantly styled, and her eyes sparkled with a youthful glow that belied her years. As she fastened a pair of pearl earrings, a gift from Richard on their 25th anniversary, she caught sight of him in the reflection, watching her from the doorway. "You look beautiful, Lizzie," Richard said softly, his voice filled with admiration and love. Elizabeth turned to face him, taking in the sight of her husband in his best suit. "And you're as handsome as the day I married you," she replied with a warm smile. As they made their way downstairs, Elizabeth's mind wandered over the events of the past few months. After deciding to give their marriage another chance, she and Richard had committed to counseling, rediscovering each other through date nights, long talks, and even a romantic weekend getaway. It hadn't been easy. There were arguments, moments of doubt, and old wounds that needed healing. But with each passing day, their bond grew stronger, deeper, and more resilient than ever before. The living room had been transformed for the occasion. Flowers adorned every surface, their fragrance mingling with the scent of autumn that drifted in through the open windows. In the center of it all stood young Elizabeth, radiant in a simple white dress, her dark curls adorned with tiny white flowers. "You look gorgeous, sweetheart," Elizabeth said, embracing the young woman who had become like a granddaughter to her. Young Elizabeth beamed. "I can't believe this day is finally here," she said, her voice trembling with excitement. "And I'm so glad you're both here to share it with me." The doorbell rang, and Maria hurried to answer it. She returned moments later with a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, Thomas Reeves Jr., young Elizabeth's half-brother, whom they had discovered during the process of settling Thomas Sr.'s estate. The family circle had expanded once again, bringing with it new connections and healing old wounds. As the small group made their way to the backyard, where an intimate gathering of friends and family waited, Elizabeth felt a sense of profound gratitude wash over her. The garden she had tended for decades now served as the perfect backdrop for this new beginning. The ceremony was simple yet deeply moving. Young Elizabeth exchanged vows with her fiancé, a kind-hearted teacher she had met during her stay in Connecticut. As Elizabeth watched, her hand clasped tightly in Richard's, she marveled at the twists and turns of fate that had brought them all to this moment. Later, as the reception was in full swing, Elizabeth found a quiet moment alone with Richard near the old oak tree where they had shared their first kiss over 5 decades ago. "Can you believe how much has changed since that day I asked for a divorce?" Elizabeth mused, leaning into Richard's embrace. Richard chuckled softly. "If someone had told me then that we'd be here now, celebrating young Elizabeth's wedding and falling in love all over again, I wouldn't have believed them." Elizabeth turned to face him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'm so glad we found our way back to each other, Richard. These past few months have been, well, they've been some of the happiest of my life." Richard cupped her face gently in his hands. "Mine too, Lizzie. And I promise you, I'll spend every day making sure you never doubt my love again." As they sealed their renewed commitment with a tender kiss, the sounds of laughter and music drifted over from the reception. Elizabeth looked around at the gathering, Claire chatting animatedly with Maria, young Elizabeth and her new husband sharing a dance, their grandchildren playing tag between the tables, and felt her heart swell with joy. The journey that had begun with a request for divorce had come full circle, leading them not to an ending, but to a new beginning filled with love, understanding, and the unbreakable bonds of family, both old and new. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the celebration, Elizabeth and Richard joined the dancing, their movements as graceful and in sync as they had been on their own wedding day. They had weathered storms, faced challenges, and emerged stronger, their love deeper and more profound than ever before. And as they swayed to the music, surrounded by the family they had built and nurtured over a lifetime, Elizabeth knew with absolute certainty that the best chapters of their story were still to come. Thank you for listening until the end. Share your opinion about the story in the comments and let us know which character you liked the most. If this story touched you and you want to hear more, click on the next story appearing on your screen. Leave a like and subscribe to our channel so we can build a great community of people who share emotional stories together. Until the next story.